this friction within the party is going to be the thing that someone's going to have to get a grip of. It's fine to kind of everyone worship Nigel, but ultimately there's a bigger group of people that have also got to get on and try and move things forward as a party.
Reform UK has suspended its high-profile supporter Tim Montgomery after the Conservative Home founder criticised the party's Home Affairs spokesman Zia Youssef for not being a team player. The comments were made on the Spectator's Coffee House Shots podcast.
It was unprecedented for Nigel to criticise him last week, but did he take down the tweet that Nigel could? No, he wouldn't. So he's loyal to Nigel, as I think he has to be if he wants to succeed him. But actually, in terms of being willing to sort of really play as a team player, he has regularly, James, you've mentioned, his omnipresence on Twitter. He has consistently freelanced on Twitter on, for example, accepting Conservative candidates, even though he knew they were being wooed. But it was his way of trying to undermine that policy. So I think, the report at the weekend that talked about Nigel falling out of love with Zia, I think that's true.
Well, now Tim Montgomery has been temporarily suspended from the party. He's posted on X after that suspension.
I have no regrets over what I've said or done, and I'd like to think that this appeal process will be genuine, and I will certainly be making the case that my contribution, my constructive criticism, is not only what I said I would characterise my membership, but I think it's a healthy part of any political party.
Well, there we are, Tim Montgomery expressing what he thinks about the way that reform is being led and whether there is enough team support and team playing by some of those involved. But just putting Tim aside, we know that there's been sort of little ructions within reform recently. Kitty, what do you think of it? Do you think that there is a bit of a breakdown of communications, that maybe they're not quite as united as they'd like to be?
I think it was very easy when they were effectively winning and they were doing so well in the polls. And then recently they've dipped in the polls. I think probably some of that was sort of natural shedding after reaching so high. They've had a series of internal disagreements about direction. You talk to some of them privately and they are concerned it's a sort of it's quite autocratic from the top, and that's not just Nigel Farage, that coming from Zia Youssef too, that sort of two or three men in a room handing down sort of tablets from a mountain and not really sort of consulting anyone else. And I think probably this is partly because of the way Reform grew up. It grew up not as a sort of grassroots organisation, but as a business that was then sort of democratised later. And I don't think the democratisation process is perhaps as complete as some would like, including Tim Montgomery. And I think Tim's right. He was offering what is effectively quite mild constructive criticism. When you look at how Labour tears great chunks out of each other and the Tories, so I think a wiser leader, although Tim said in his clip that he didn't think that Nigel Farage knew about the suspension, but I think a wiser leadership would have just sort of taken this one on the chin and I don't know, you can freeze someone up privately for a bit, tell them that, put them on the naughty step and not invite them to events and things, and then just let it all blow over. I mean, it's August, these things get magnified. Mm-hmm. They would have been sort of better off just to ignore it. And the accusations flow around Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef that they're thin-skinned and can't take criticism, and this sort of, I think, I'm afraid, slightly proves the point.
Well, Jo, this was Tim being a candid friend in a way, but there have been other criticisms of the way that the party's led, and of course, they've led the polls, and now there's seemingly a catch-up by the new Prime Minister leading Labour. What do you make of where the Reform team are at the moment and what they're making of their current position?
It feels a bit like they're panicking. It feels like they've been worried about the investigation into Nigel's finances, and they didn't kind of carry on with the press conferences. Everything sort of got paused, and it started up again now the by-election's been concluded. But there definitely seems that it feels like they've been knocked off course. I'm really surprised about Tim being suspended, because Tim's known. I mean, Tim was attractive to them because he's a commentator, and he can be controversial and he can be very outspoken. He's also an incredibly gentle man, an incredibly kind man. I mean, he's someone who's been an extraordinary friend to me over the years at different times, and I don't see him very often, but whenever I do, he's always got a kind word. He's, we disagree on things, but there's never any malice or ill intent, and it just seems as though there's been a sort of a very quick reaction when the politicians themselves have been sort of tearing a few strips off each other relatively publicly at times. Yeah. And the idea that someone else who's actually, I think, been quite a useful advocate for them has ended up in the position that he has. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some sort of, he gets brought back in and there's some sort of apology or something, because it just strikes me that I think this is a move that they may well regret. But it does feel like this slip in the polls, the investigation into Nigel Farage, and and even sort of others and questions that have been raised, it just feels like they've lost a bit of their sparkle. And their conference is only a few weeks away.
Yes,
they've got a lot of ground to make up. They've got to be concentrating on what they're going to be talking about there. This is a time when parties normally are hunkered down on their speeches and announcements and things, so they've got to get their act together pretty quick.
And Kitty, do we have any timeline for the investigation now has been reopened by the parliamentary watchdog into the allegations about Nigel Farage's finances? Do we have a timescale for that, or could that drag on for several months?
My understanding is that the commissioner had been working over the summer, so by the summer I mean the parliamentary recess, is not bound by the parliamentary timetable, so that he doesn't have to wait until September, whenever it is, and then pause again. So he sort of carries on, and he sort of started the day that Nigel Farage got re-elected in Clacton, and I think, although don't hold me to this, that it could be fairly quick, so it could be sort of September time rather than later in the autumn.
OK, and at that point then Nigel Farage will know if there's a recommendation for a vote, which then could go back to the Clacton electorate to decide if they want to have another by-election.
Yes, but I think all the people who may be sort of hoping that if there's another by-election that Farage could be beaten by a sort of more mainstream candidate are slightly wishful thinking, because I went down there a couple of weeks ago to talk to people in Clacton about what they thought. And yes, there are more people who sort of don't find him attractive, don't like him, don't support him. There are, by contrast, an awful lot of people who think he's the bee's knees and will support him come what may, actually. And I genuinely don't think if there's a second by-election it will be kind of the great hope that everyone who's anti him will get what they want.
Joe?
I do think the challenge will be about reform just being about Nigel Farage and the story being just about Nigel Farage. There are plenty of other people in that party, particularly given that those that defected from the Conservatives, who were going there because they were probably promised that they were going to get profile and they were going to have a chance to really push things forward. And some have been more prominent than others. There's been no Suella Braverman, really. We haven't really seen much of her, but we've seen a fair amount of Robert Jenrick. But this friction within the party is going to be the thing that someone's going to have to get a grip of. It's fine to kind of everyone worship Nigel, but ultimately there's a bigger group of people that have also got to get on and try and move things forward as a party.
And also, if you jumped ship from the Tories or whoever, you were basically promised you were backing a winner, weren't you? And that looks less likely now than it did even 6 months ago.